At 22:30 local time on July 2, 2025, the crew of a Ukrainian Vilkha-M launcher sat in the darkened cabin of their 8x8 vehicle, engines idling low, as the humid Donbas night wrapped around them. What began as a carefully planned strike mission was about to become a fight for survival. They had prepared to fire on the massive Russian ammunition depot at Kartsysk, a mission that could cripple weeks of Russian artillery operations. But before they could finish uploading target data, the crew's passive receivers came alive with a chilling frequency pattern. The operator froze as the jagged signals scrolled across his screen, electromagnetic emissions from a Russian Zoopark-1M counterbattery radar, only 38 kilometers away. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He knew exactly what it meant. The Russians were hunting them. Zoopark radars could track artillery fire at ranges up to 23 kilometers and triangulate launch sites in under 30 seconds. The Vilkha-M crew had fired a harassment barrage barely 15 minutes earlier. That was all the Russians needed to lock on to their general area. Which meant that right now, Russian BM-30 Smerch rocket launchers were being cued in on their coordinates. Standard response time, 6 minutes. That's all the time they had to either launch and run, or die in place. The crew chief barked out orders, his voice steady but tense. Emergency launch procedures, load now. The gunner's hands trembled as he pulled up the hardened military tablet. Their launcher carried 4 precision-guided missiles, each one a 2-ton spear of Ukrainian engineering, weighing 800 kilograms with a warhead powerful enough to punch through reinforced concrete. The tablet flickered under his gloved fingers as he raced to upload GPS coordinates for the depot. Normally, the process took 3 minutes. Tonight, they had 90 seconds. Every second dragged like an eternity. The encrypted data link hummed as it interfaced with the guidance systems. Each missile demanded perfect information: GPS, GLONASS, and inertial navigation calibration. Together, these systems promised a 10 to 30 meter accuracy at maximum range. But uploading those coordinates while a Russian radar painted their position added a suffocating layer of pressure. Then, at 22:32, disaster struck. The screen glitched. The Russians had begun flooding the airwaves with GPS jamming across every frequency. The tablet lost satellite lock. A sickening pit grew in the gunner's stomach. No GPS meant no guarantee of hitting the target. He switched frantically to manual input, trusting the pre-surveyed coordinates and his own precision. If he was wrong by even 5 meters, the mission would fail, and they would have revealed themselves for nothing. Meanwhile, another warning flared. The vehicle's thermal sensors registered sudden plumes of heat signatures northeast, Russian Smerch launchers. They had already fired. At 22:33, the loader slammed the blast door shut, his hands shaking as he called out distance estimates. Smerch rockets traveled at nearly 1,200 meters per second. Time to impact, 4 minutes. The Vilkha's automatic system could prepare 1 missile every 20 seconds. But doctrine required spacing launches 45 seconds apart to prevent overheating. They didn't have that luxury. The crew chief's voice cut through the chaos. All 4, maximum rate. Fire and move. At 22:34, the first Vilkha missile thundered out of its launch tube. The blast rocked the vehicle, sending an incandescent plume skyward that was instantly visible to Russian radar and infrared sensors. The crew didn't watch it climb. There was no time. The gunner was already keying in the second launch, sweat dripping into his eyes, as the driver revved the transporter's diesel engine, preparing to bolt. At 22:34 and 30 seconds, the second Vilkha-M missile ripped free of its tube, the roar echoing across the empty fields like thunder. The exhaust column carved a 40-meter thermal scar into the night sky, a signal flare to every Russian infrared sensor within 50 kilometers. Inside the cabin, the gunner's hands shook as he locked in the third missile, his fingers moving on instinct even as the howl of incoming Smerch rockets began to rise above the engine's growl. That sound, a distant whistle turning sharper by the second, meant they had less than 30 seconds before the first impacts. The Zoopark radar had already completed its job. Russian fire control units now had their coordinates narrowed to within 50 meters. Somewhere in the distance, dozens of BM-30 rockets were already arcing high overhead, each one capable of leveling a city block. "Third ready," the gunner yelled, his voice breaking. At 22:35 sharp, the launcher belched fire again. The shockwave shattered windows in an abandoned farmhouse 200 meters away. The Vilkha's heat shielding crackled with stress, designed for controlled salvos, not this breakneck sequence. They were running their system on the ragged edge. The driver's knuckles whitened as he held the engine at 2,200 RPM, ready to slam into gear the second the final missile cleared. Standard doctrine demanded displacement 90 seconds after the first launch to survive counter-battery fire. Tonight, doctrine was a luxury they couldn't afford. Their lives depended on shaving every unnecessary second. Fourth tube online, the loader shouted, his hands moving like a machine despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The crew chief's face was lit crimson by warning lights, but his voice stayed calm. Send it. At 22:35 and 30 seconds, the fourth and final missile streaked into the sky just as the first Russian Smerch warhead detonated 400 meters north of their position. The explosion hurled dirt and jagged steel into the air, shrapnel clattering across the launcher's armored hull. Another impact bracketed their position on the south side, the shockwave rocking the 30-ton vehicle on its suspension. Move now, the chief barked. The driver slammed the gearshift forward, and the Vilkha's massive tires clawed at the dirt road. The transporter lurched into motion, the crew jostled violently in their harnesses as more rockets slammed down behind them. The night turned into a storm of fire and fragmentation, each impact shredding the ground they had occupied seconds earlier. Inside, the gunner stole one last glance at his screen. 4 missiles were airborne, their navigation systems locked onto a course for Kartzisk. Each streaked eastward at over 1,100 meters per second, climbing and banking as pre-programmed evasive maneuvers activated. They had done their part. Now survival was the only mission left. As the transporter roared across uneven ground, the crew chief exhaled for the first time in minutes. They had revealed themselves to every Russian radar operator within 100 kilometers, but if even one missile reached its target, the risk was worth it. The ammunition depot at Kartzisk held more Russian artillery firepower than any single Ukrainian brigade could withstand. Destroying it wasn't just another strike, it was survival for hundreds of soldiers at the front. At 22:40, the lead Vilkha missile descended through 8,000 meters altitude, its onboard flight computer processing navigation updates 50 times per second. Jamming signatures clawed at its receivers, trying to blind it, trying to drag it off course. But the triple redundant system switched seamlessly, from degraded GPS to GLONASS, then finally to pure inertial navigation, its fiber-optic gyros keeping it steady. Somewhere ahead, Russian air defenses were already turning toward the threat. The real battle, missile versus missile, system versus system, was about to begin. At 22:41 hours and 15 seconds, the Russian Tor-M2 crew finally picked up the first Vilkha-M rocket on their scopes. The missile appeared as a sharp, fast-moving blip descending through 6,000 meters, its radar cross-section faint but unmistakable. The system's phased array antenna locked on, pouring 600 kilowatts of power into a cone that followed the target's dive. The operator knew what he was looking at, a precision-guided strike round, the kind designed to annihilate hardened depots. He had seconds to react. Target lock, engaging. The command was barely out before the first pair of 9 M338 interceptors erupted vertically from the Tor's tubes. Their motors flared white-hot, pushing the missiles to Mach 2.8 in under 3 seconds. A straight ballistic trajectory should have made the intercept trivial, but the Vilkha wasn't flying predictably. At 22:42 sharp, the Ukrainian missile executed its first programmed maneuver, a 15-degree bank to the left, paired with a slight descent angle adjustment. It was subtle, but enough to drag the intercept point off the Tor's firing solution. The fire control computer scrambled to recompute. The operator authorized the shots anyway, his voice betraying tension. Both interceptors raced ahead, guided by radio commands relayed from the ground vehicle. But at 22:42 and 30 seconds, the Vilkha twisted again, 20 degrees to the right, pitching slightly up before resuming its dive. The maneuver added only 300 meters to its flight path, but it completely invalidated the Russian missile's intercept windows. The operator swore, switching to manual override as he cued a second salvo. 2 more interceptors hissed skyward, their exhaust plumes streaking the night. These flew truer, detonating within 50 meters of the Vilkha's aluminum fuselage. Shrapnel peppered its skin, sparks cascading in the darkness. For a second, the operator thought they had scored a kill. But the missile's hardened casing and redundant systems absorbed the punishment. Accelerometers registered a 2-degree deviation, which the flight computer corrected instantly. The warhead was intact, and the missile continued its plunge. 18 kilometers downrange, the Russian crew barely had time to register that the target was still alive before a second Vilkha appeared, screaming through their sector only 30 seconds behind the first. Panic edged into their training. They had 4 missiles left, 2 targets closing fast, and no room for mistakes. To the east, a Panzer's 1 battery scrambled to join the fight. Its operators swiveled their radar to cover the blind spot from which the missiles were approaching, but the Vilkhas were already on the edge of their effective envelope. At maximum traverse, the turret took precious seconds to lock. Their 57 times 10 to the power of 6 interceptors, capable of Mach 3, armed and launched, splitting fire across both incoming targets in a desperate attempt to overwhelm them. It violated doctrine. Splitting fire meant diluted kill probability, but the crews had no choice. As the interceptors streaked toward their prey, the lead Vilkha dropped below 1,500 meters altitude. It was entering the most dangerous phase, the terrain masked zone, where radar struggled to distinguish missile from ground clutter. The Russians knew it. The Ukrainians had designed it that way. By now, Russian electronic warfare units were flooding the airwaves with jamming energy, trying to smother the missiles' inertial corrections. But the Vilkha's fiber-optic gyroscopes barely noticed. Precision held. At 22:43, the battlefield was lit by streaks of fire, Russian interceptors climbing, Ukrainian rockets diving. Both sides had seconds to decide the outcome. At 22:49 local time, the first Vilkha-M plunged into its terminal phase, streaking 8 kilometers from the Kartsysk ammunition depot. By now, 4 separate Russian air defense systems had locked onto the missile, their overlapping radar beams illuminating it like a spotlight in the sky. The next 45 seconds would decide whether months of Ukrainian intelligence and planning ended in triumph or failure. The Torem-2 crew had one chance left. Their radar tracked the missile hugging a ridgeline at just 400 meters altitude, using the terrain itself as a shield. The operator preset his final interceptors for the calculated pop-up point where the missile would crest into clear air. He waited, heart hammering, finger poised on the fire authorization key. 3 kilometers south, the Panzer's 1 battery whined into overdrive. Its operators, frustrated by clutter and blind sectors, finally acquired a solid track. They launched 6 57 times 10 to the power of 6 missiles in pairs, splitting them between 2 approaching targets. Each interceptor screamed skyward at Mach 3, but by dividing firepower, they had slashed their odds of killing either target. Doctrine demanded saturation fire, 4 missiles per target, but fear forced their hands. On the ground, the last line of defense stirred. A ZS-23-4 Shilka, its squat turret bristling with 423mm autocannons, traversed toward the ridge. The gunner wiped sweat from his eyes, his fire control radar struggling to distinguish the missile from the noise of the burning horizon. At 600 meters, he'd have 3 seconds at best to lay down a curtain of fire. The Shilka's quad barrels could spit 3,400 rounds per minute, a wall of tungsten meant to tear fast movers apart. He gritted his teeth and waited. At 22:49 and 10 seconds, the lead Vilkha crested the ridge. The Tor operator slammed the key, his last 2 9M338 missiles erupting from their tubes. Their fiery tails arced skyward, racing toward the predicted intercept. But the Vilkha's speed, over 1,100 meters per second, collapsed the timeline. The interceptors had 8 seconds to catch it. The second Vilkha appeared 2 kilometers north, cresting almost simultaneously. The Russians had expected staggered salvos. Instead, they faced synchronized death. The Panzer operators, startled, split their fire further, their 6 interceptors now stretched across 2 diving targets. Radio command guidance screamed in their headsets as they tried to herd the missiles into a perfect collision course. At 380 meters altitude, the Vilkha's proximity fuse armed itself, its warhead primed. Below, Russian soldiers at the depot abandoned forklifts and sprinted for bunkers, sirens wailing across the compound. Thousands of tons of ordnance lay stacked under corrugated roofs, impossible to move in time. Every second ticked like a drumbeat. Tracer fire lit the night. The Shilka opened up at 600 meters, its 4 barrels roaring. Tracers lanced upward in a shimmering cone, thousands of rounds filling the sky with glowing death. The gunner held the trigger for 2.5 seconds, 280 rounds, before the missile tore through his stream like a phantom. At 300 meters per second closure rate, his margin for error was 0. Above, the Tor's last interceptors flashed past the Vilkha, detonating 30 meters behind. The shockwave buffeted the missile but failed to rip through its hardened casing. Shrapnel peppered its tail, accelerometers detected a wobble, but the flight computer corrected instantly. The warhead remained intact, plunging toward its prey. At 22:49 and 15 seconds, the first Vilkha's radar altimeter registered the depot roof 5 meters below. The warhead triggered instantly. 170 kilograms of high explosive detonated on contact, blasting the eastern warehouse into a geyser of fire and steel. The pressure wave collapsed its walls in a heartbeat. Inside, pallets of artillery shells flashed white-hot, feeding the inferno. This was just the beginning. At 22:49 and 15 seconds, the first Vilkha's detonation touched off the nearest stacks of 152mm artillery shells. Wooden crates vaporized as the blast wave squeezed air pockets into instant fireballs, temperatures spiking above 3,000 degrees Celsius. Propellant charges, stable under rough handling, ignited like dry tinder. In less than 300 milliseconds, the first secondary explosion ripped outward, a chain reaction beginning with terrifying inevitability. 30 seconds later, the second Vilkha slammed into the depot's northern warehouse. Its warhead punched through reinforced roofing before erupting in the middle of hundreds of BM-21 Grad rockets. Dozens of 122mm rockets detonated simultaneously, each a miniature missile with 18 kilograms of propellant. The combined force ripped the roof off like paper, the 15-ton structure vaulting skyward before collapsing in flames. Rockets launched themselves in random arcs, some slamming into nearby hillsides, others skipping like fiery stones across the depot yard. At 22:50 and 20 seconds, the third missile hit the western warehouse. Its blast ignited pallets of specialized warheads, cluster munition variants designed to scatter mines. Instead, they cooked off inside their casings, bursting like steel grenades within the building. The entire western wing folded in on itself, steel beams bending like straws as fire rolled across the compound. Burning propellant sprayed outward, creating rivers of flaming fuel that clung to whatever they touched, spreading the inferno like napalm. Then came the true catastrophe. At 22:51, the firestorm reached the depot's crown jewels, long rows of S-300 surface-to-air missiles stored in wooden cradles. Each missile carried 133 kilograms of high explosive plus a solid-fueled sustainer motor. When the first one went off, the resulting detonations set off the entire row. The shockwave tore through Kartsysk's industrial district, shattering windows 3 kilometers away and flattening walls inside the compound. The blast plume rose like a volcanic eruption, visible across Donbas. By 22:52, the fourth Vilkha struck, but it no longer mattered where. The depot had become an open wound of fire and chaos. Its warhead only added fuel to an inferno already consuming thousands of tons of ammunition. Rockets launched themselves blindly into the night, slamming into fences, nearby roads, even Russian support vehicles fleeing the site. At 22:55, an underground bunker containing Smerch rockets detonated. The explosion gouged a 40-meter crater, hurling soil and metal skyward in a mushroom cloud that social media users filmed from miles away. Fireballs painted the horizon, each secondary blast echoing like artillery thunder. By 23:10, the depot was unrecognizable. Four separate warehouses had collapsed into molten heaps. Flames stretched hundreds of meters high. Even conservative estimates put losses at over 3,000 tons of ammunition, weeks of Russian firepower, obliterated in less than 20 minutes. The strategic impact was immediate. Russian artillery brigades that had once fired with near-limitless stocks suddenly found themselves rationing shells. Supply chains fractured, stockpiles dispersed to smaller depots far from the front, safer but less efficient. Exactly the outcome Ukrainian planners had envisioned. For the Vilkha crew, survival was victory. Hours later, their transporters sat hidden under camouflage netting 20 kilometers away. Exhausted, ears still ringing from near misses, they listened over encrypted comms as Ukrainian intelligence confirmed the devastation. They had cheated death by seconds, outflown Russia's best radars, and crippled one of the largest ammunition hubs in Donbas. And as dawn broke over the smoking ruins of Kartsysk, the message was clear: Ukraine's rockets were not just weapons. They were rewriting the battlefield.